All right, I'm gonna kick this off now. So thanks everyone for coming to the second session of our performance development series. Today, obviously, as you know, will be hosted by Matthew Labers. And just so you guys know, and Matt will probably correct me or reintroduce himself anyways, he's an NCCP trained coach under the Cycling Canada Intro to Competition series. Did I get that right, Matt?
Yeah.
And you guys all know him, or if you don't, you'll see him on regular as a ride leader on the mountain bike side and road. But he also does a lot of our skill sessions throughout the year in years where we can gather together. So thank you, Matt. I know you put a lot of work into this presentation tonight, and I've already seen it, so I know it's some like really quality content. So I think everyone will be happy with and excited to hear what he has to say. But before I hand it over to Matt, I got to do a bit of housekeeping work. First thing, we are planning to record this and record the gallery view and the view of all the participants. So if you're not a member of the Dark Horse Flyers, we have to ask you to turn off your video. Or if you've checked the box saying that you don't give permission to Dark Horse Flyers for your likeness or photograph or images for social, then we also need you to turn off your video. Otherwise, we can't use that portion of the content. So I'd say ask you to do that now if that's you, or if you just don't want your background to be shown either. Lastly, for Q&A, Matt has some like scheduled breaks for question and answer. So what we'll do is we'll just reserve them for those moments when Matt kind of opens up the panel. You'll see a slide come up, say Q&A, and then we can do it there and as well as at the end. But with that being covered, Matt, if you're ready, I can hand it over to you. And I think the screen's ready for you to share as well.
All right, awesome. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Once again, my name's Matthew Lavers. I've been a member of Dark Horse for a bunch of years now, and I lead club rides and I run skills sessions. As Brody mentioned, I'm a trained cycling coach in Cycling Canada's Intro to Competition stream, which is all about helping cyclists improve their skills and performance. And tonight, we're going to talk a bit about the basics of training with a focus towards how to improve our performance on club rides. A lot of my source material tonight comes directly from Cycling Canada's own course reference material, as well as from Paul Gerbala, who was one of my instructors. Paul holds a master's in exercise physiology and works with Cycling Canada. He actually wrote most of the reference material. I'll also be touching on material by Dr. Stephen Seiler, who's an exercise physiologist at the University of Agder in Norway. Some of my information is from Andrew Randall, who's a former professional cyclist and cycling coach, and most of you may know him from the cycling gym. Finally, there's one or two items from Trainer Road's training blog. They did some excellent visualizations that I've borrowed for tonight. So with those acknowledgements out of the way, let's dive right in. What is training? Training is stressing the various systems in the body towards effecting a physiological adaptation and increasing the body's capability of performing future work. More simply, when we do work, the body changes itself to make future work easier. And that's amazing. But how does that work? We start with our training session and we experience fatigue as we train. When we go through a recovery period or a rest, the fatigue recovers. And now, importantly, our body builds itself back stronger so that the next session is easier. If we were to continue resting, our improvements will eventually regress back to our baseline. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but first, let's get some of the important terminology out of the way. The training stimulus is a workout that puts the body under load to induce a physiological response. It needs to be enough load to tire us or cause fatigue. Fatigue in the training sense is the reduction in capability that comes immediately after a workout. Compensation is the recovery from fatigue through rest. And then supercompensation is the body's effort to make future work fatigue us less. We can see all of these phases represented in our training cycle graphic here. We have our training stimulus, our workout, fatigue, where we become less capable temporarily, compensation as we recover, and supercompensation, where we see some measure of improvement. And this is the basic building block of training. Now, if we structure multiple training sessions together at the right time, we get something over time that looks like this. Here, we've timed our next training session to build on the supercompensation from the previous session. And again, we're building ourselves up bit by bit over weeks and months. So how do we make this performance improvement happen? Well, there are two crucial principles that we're going to need to follow. First up, we'll need a plan. The plan is going to tell us what we need to do to become a better cyclist. And we'll go over the parts of that in a moment. Secondly, and more importantly than the first, we need to follow the plan. When the plan says to rest, we're going to need to rest. Remember, compensation and supercompensation only happen during recovery. All right, so on to training plans. A proper training plan will tell us the frequency of our training, the intensity of each session, how long each session will last, and importantly, it has to fit our goals and our training capabilities. So frequency, how often can I train? When we train, we're working a whole slew of different physiological systems. We're working the heart and lungs, muscle fibers, bone, tendon, ligaments, and several others. All of these require different training, and all of them recover at different rates. Tendons, for example, take a long time to recover or to improve. So if we do sessions which stress our tendons too much and too often, we risk an injury that's going to take a long time to recover. Intensity. How much work am I doing? We need a way to measure or quantify our effort. And there are three main ways that we can use. We can measure our heart rate by use of a monitoring device. We can measure our actual work output using a power meter, or we can subjectively quantify our effort on a scale of perceived exertion. Now, these days, the power meter gets all the credit. They're excellent for their ability to precisely measure work output and inform us about our gains in ability. But they have a couple of downsides. The first is cost, usually in the thousands for something halfway reliable. Secondly, and importantly to us, is that they don't tell us what's going on with our physiology. They need to be used very carefully in conjunction with heart rate monitoring in order to provide the benefits that we're looking for. And most amateur athletes tend towards a sort of tunnel vision where they just watch the watts. A heart rate monitor, on the other hand, is a relatively inexpensive system of monitoring the body's response to work. Computer and chest strap together come in as little as $160. They're ideal for monitoring aerobic efforts. It's important to note that heart rate can be affected by a number of factors, both internal and external. And this is not a downside. We want to know what our body is trying to tell us. There are, of course, some limitations when we're talking about really intense efforts. Heart rate lags about 30 to 45 seconds behind a change in effort. And once we get near or above our aerobic limit, a heart rate monitor starts to lose its usefulness. Now, the third option is a completely free of cost option. Prior to the advent of portable electronics, everyone used a system of perceived exertion. Basically, how hard does this feel to me? Now, there are many scales out there. The one that's kind of considered right now to be the most universally precise and repeatable is the Borg scale. Now, the Borg scale ranges from a 6 being no effort to 20 being the absolute hardest that I can work. All right, so we have a basic understanding of how intensity works. On to duration. Effectively, how much time am I spending at a given intensity? So remembering that we're working different adaptations in different physiological systems, not all of our sessions are going to be the same length. Aerobic endurance, for example, requires working at that intensity for about an hour before any meaningful training of that system takes place. How do I know what kind of effort to do, though? Well, that's where the final element comes in, which is specificity. If I want to be a better cyclist, running or rowing are not the best way to make that happen. Yes, I'll probably make some gains through transferable adaptations, but the best way to get better on the bike is ultimately to ride your bike. And likewise, the best way to gain sprint power is with sprint intervals. And for endurance, with rides targeting the endurance system. So the question really begs, what do you want to do? Do you want to race crits or cyclocross? Or are you looking to get better hanging on to the Saturday club ride? The base of our training will be similar for either one, but the specific demands of these two goals are very different. So we'll ultimately have some differences in the training. Also very important, what's my availability? If I were to take a plan for a full-time athlete and try to follow it, even if I gave up my day job, I'm going to fail spectacularly. Training sessions need to be adjusted to the training goals of the athlete based on available time and the capabilities of that specific athlete. So accepting that I only have 6 to 8 hours per week to train, it can be really tempting to jam in as much intensity as possible into as little time as possible. And this is a mistake that time-crunched athletes make all the time, myself included. That way lies overtraining and injuries, and I don't know about you guys, but I've had more than enough of those. The idea of no pain, no gain that a lot of us grew up with just doesn't align with the science. We might see limited short-term gains from such an approach, but that's not really what we're after. We want that perpetual improvement. We want our training to be sustainable. So I'm going to pause right there and open the floor to questions.
Matthew,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Hey, Matthew, it's Campbell here. So I'm in the group that would be just wanting to be able to hang on with the group rides. And then the other thing I find is I've been mountain bike or trail riding for the last 2 years. It's the only time I've ever done it consistently. And I find that the intensity of that is much greater than being on a road bike. and it's sort of harder to sustain. So like a couple hours on the trails feels like 4 hours on a road bike, or roughly that, thereabouts. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's different training required for those two activities.
So there is a little bit of divergence in training if you were going to focus in specifically on one thing versus another. Broadly speaking, the base of your training is going to be very similar, because there are some carryovers. And in the next section, I'm going to introduce a training philosophy that's going to help you with both.
Thank you.
Matt, we
Danielle,
got
you
one
have your
question.
hands up.
There you go.
I do, thanks. So I don't know if you're going to touch on this a little bit later, but I know to train specifically for a sport, you want to actually do that sport, but is there an amount of cross training that you would do, whether it be weights or another sport that would add some benefit and some time for other, I guess, balance out your muscles or things like that?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. I am going to touch on that a little bit later on, but yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So I'll go over a couple of those things and what they are at the end.
Great, thanks.
And Annie, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I don't know if you've looked at it, Matt, but what do you think about the preset sort of training you could get on Zwift and things like that?
I'm not familiar myself with what the training philosophy that Zwift is using.
Okay.
So I can't speak to that from a place of knowledge.
Sure, fair enough. Thank you.
But in the next section, I'll go over the training philosophy that I've leaned towards in the last couple of years, through a huge amount of trial and error, mostly error, and yeah, you can see kind of where my mindset is, and if that differs from Zwift, then at the end ask me about it, and I'm happy to clarify more.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions before we continue to the next section?
Yeah, I have a question, Matt. And if this is going to be covered, just say so. You say you can't train hard all the time, which is absolutely true. So, are there any kind of rules of thumb? So, say for example, if I ride 3 days a week, and I certainly can't train on every one of those rides, I can't push myself and be extremely uncomfortable for the entire 3 rides. But is it like 1 ride a week and the other 2 should be endurance rides, or should I just work hard for a portion of each of the rides, or is that something you'll?
Okay, so that's a perfect question to segue into the next section.
Great, there we go.
Okay, so with that, I'm gonna continue on to the next section of our talk tonight. So Dr. Seiler, who I mentioned earlier, is an exercise physiologist who studies endurance athletes. And for 20 plus years, he's quantified the training of the world's top athletes across a variety of sports and tested those findings in long-term studies versus popular training philosophies. The finding is the 80-20 principle, or polarized training. And studies by Dr. Seiler and by many others, hundreds of studies actually, have found repeatedly that this polarized training model produces improvements as good or better than the many other models tested, and with less risk of detraining or of injury. And importantly for us, it holds true even if we don't have a lot of time to train. The basic premise is that you spend the bulk of your time building and optimizing your aerobic engine, and a relatively small amount of time working very hard intervals. We still do intervals. They improve power production and lactate processing, which are super important. But we aren't going out every day doing sprints. Again, studies have found that even with relatively few weekly training hours, this balance gives consistently better results than other models such as sweet spot training or HIIT training, without the associated risks of detraining or injury that accompany many of these other models. So let's take a moment to quantify these zones. Our endurance zone, the green zone, falls below lactate turning point 1. Now, LT1 is the first exercise intensity that results in an increase in blood lactate. And this varies by individual, but generally works out to approximately 80% heart rate and below. We have our VO2 max zone, the red zone, which is above lactate turn point 2. So LT2 is a marked change in the rate of blood lactate increase, where our anaerobic system really starts to assist. And you may know it by its other name of lactate threshold. Now, again, it varies, but it's usually above 90% heart rate. This is going to be the focus of our harder days. The threshold zone or yellow zone is sandwiched between lactate turn point 1 and turn point 2. Now, here we see less of our focused training time because we don't get as much adaptation for the time we invest as we would in the red zone. This lands approximately in the 80 to 90% range. Now, again, these ranges vary by individual. Now, this graph is not random, by the way. These relative training volumes are based on 4 years of training by Team Sunweb, the UCI World Pro Team, a group of highly trained professional cyclists who can average 450 watts for half an hour or more. Their annual average during training, 191 watts and 65% max heart rate. This is how the top tier athletes in our sport train. Now, how do we apply this to our own training? If we've got 4 training days available to us, we're going to spend 3 of them training our aerobic endurance energy system, and only 1 day going hard, training our VO2 max adaptations. Why does training slow make us faster, though? Really, it comes down to how our body converts fuel. And there's a quick physiology lesson here. When we're working in our endurance zone, oxygen and glucose get combined in the muscles, where the glucose is broken down into the energy molecule that muscles use, which is ATP. With enough oxygen, this process is very efficient and also has the potential to break down fat molecules, which produces significantly more energy than glucose does. Endurance training improves how efficiently oxygen can absorb through our lungs. It improves how much oxygenated blood is circulated with every heartbeat. If each heartbeat delivers more oxygen, the heart can beat more slowly for the same work. Or the heart can deliver more oxygen when needed for harder work outputs. Now that means our aerobic system can now produce more power before we have to start recruiting our anaerobic system to do any work at all. The end goal of all this is that we're pushing more watts for the same physiological demand. So that's the why. Now, as to the how, to train our aerobic endurance, we need to be doing rides of at least 60 minutes in that endurance zone. We can add in some efforts at tempo if your training plan calls for it. But broadly speaking, we're looking to ride in our endurance zone, that green zone up to 80% heart rate. Now, green zone, yellow zone, red zone, those don't coincide with the zones that we as cyclists see very often. So what do I mean by endurance zone? Now, as I said before, every single one of us is different. And there are different ways of measuring the same thing. Very often, you're going to see a table that looks something like this, where the training zones are broken down into nice, neat 10% increments, which if we think about it for a second, we know is impossible. Nature does not work in 10% increments. In truth, the only way to know for certain what our zones are would be to do individual lab testing, which for most of us is prohibitively expensive. But even though these zones, as displayed here, are almost certainly not accurate for any of us, they're still useful guidelines for athletes at our level. Now you'll see I've got two different heart rate measurement types here, and I'll differentiate them in a second. It's important to note there's a third option for estimating heart rate zones, which is a simple percent of maximum. That method isn't useful because resting heart rate matters. Now, let's suppose two athletes have a max heart rate of 170 beats per minute. 60% of that is 100 beats per minute. Now, an athlete with a resting heart rate of 45 has to do a fair amount more work to get to 100 than someone with a resting heart rate of 80, who may reach 100 just by walking around. So for that reason, it's much more meaningful to use the Karvonen method, which is also known as the reserve method, which accounts for resting heart rate when estimating heart rate zones. Now, quick note, resting heart rate can change over time, so it's useful to remeasure and recalculate your zones every few months. More accurate is the lactate threshold method. Now, this method uses a series of tests to calculate specifically your lactate turning points, as I mentioned before, and set your specific individual heart rate zones from there. Now, this can be done in a lab. Most accurately, it's done in a lab, but there are a wide range of test protocols that don't require a lab. And because they're all of them different, I'm not going to go any further into this method tonight. If you're looking to get into highly competitive cycling, this method is worth investigating further, and your coach can help you set up this kind of testing. Now, all of that to say, most of the time when we're working on our aerobic endurance, we're going to be working in this range of between 60 to 80% of our reserve heart rate zone. Or for those operating on the Borg scale, between 10 and 14 on the Borg scale. All right, I know that was a lot of numbers and so forth. So does anyone have any questions about that segment?
I do.
Well,
Okay. My question is for the 80-20, is there a specific time period where you'd be doing the 80-20. I know you said the slide that you would do 3 regular rides and 1 strenuous. Can you interspace it between your regular rides? Do like 80% really easy, 20% more difficult?
So if you break every ride into being 80% endurance and then do a bunch of sprints at the end,
Mhm.
it ends up stacking those sprint efforts, and your body doesn't get the appropriate chance to recover from those intense efforts, which I'm going to touch on in a moment.
Okay.
Mike, you have your hand up.
Yep. Great presentation so far, Matt. I don't know how many times you rehearsed this, but you sound like very knowledgeable and fluent in what your subject is, that's for sure. I guess my comment / question is, I was surprised that it's 80, like your endurance is up to 80%. Like I just punched my number in and it's definitely faster than I thought it was. Like I've heard about the, go slow, long in order to go fast, later kind of thing. But I was surprised at how high the number of 80% of your max. Like that's a considerable portion.
Yeah. So remember that this is referencing not what we generally think of as zone 2 endurance. This is inclusive of zone 2 endurance and zone 3 tempo. Right. So it's bottom of your threshold zone to the top of your recovery zone, as it were.
So would you call that like I'm thinking like, so I'm like running 150 beats per minute. That would be a club ride when we're not pushing, sort of thing. Was that like, can you give us an example of like where you think we would be doing that sort of pace? Like I know it's not. Like kind of tough, but I feel like I'm in endurance zone. I don't know, anytime, unless it's like a Saturday ride or like, when the nuke gets spicy or something like that. It's a bigger window than I thought. So I'm surprised by it, but the conversation is great.
Yeah. So yes, ultimately, if you're riding with kind of the appropriate club ride group, the ride should fall in your endurance zone. Right? Your endurance zone is going to carry you along for rides between 2 to 4 hours. So if you're at a pace that you can maintain for between 2 and 4 hours, then you're right in that endurance zone. Right? And as I mentioned, there is testing that you can do to determine what specifically the top of your endurance zone is. I don't know who was next. Danielle, why don't you go first?
Okay, thanks. So I'm wondering how you would recommend calculating your max heart rate. I know the old fashioned way, which was like 220 minus your age.
220 minus age. That's I wish there was some way to erase that from human consciousness, because it's garbage. Yeah. By jumping on the bike and going for a bit of a ride. And it's going to be a hard ride. And it will slowly ramp up over 10-15 minutes until in the last minute or so, you're sprinting as hard as you can. And then the peak that your heart rate hits is what your max heart rate is.
Okay. Can you do it running? Like I kind of get my heart rate higher, faster, like running, if I went for a run.
So that's a great question. We actually have different max heart rates depending on sport. Running uses different muscle groups. Specifically, it uses the glutes and quads and hamstrings really substantially. So your max heart rate might be, let's say, 195 running. And on a bike, you can't get it ever above 185, no matter how hard you're going. And that's normal.
Okay. Thanks.
Mark, then Brody.
So you mentioned this other method of determining max heart rate as or rather a percentage of max, as opposed to what I think of as max as, you know, my heart rate at the end of a time trial, which was, for me, was like 178.
Okay.
Is there a way to calculate a different max heart rate and then use those percentages more accurately, knowing what my resting heart rate is?
Yeah, so that's how the reserve or Curvonen method works. Is you take either your known max heart rate, which you determined by doing exercise, and you take your resting heart rate, which you find by strapping on your heart rate monitor, starting up your Garmin, and then laying on the sofa for 20 minutes, half an hour.
Right, right.
And then you can calculate from there any percentage zone or any percentage of that resting heart rate that you want.
Okay, so 60% would be the 60th percentile number between those two.
So I'll give you mine. My resting heart rate is 40, and my max last year. You know what, let's go the year before that. Last year was a little bit weird. So my max 2 years ago was 200. So I take 160, the difference, and let's say I want my 50% reserve heart rate. 50% of 160 is 80, and I add that to my resting heart rate of 40. So my 50% resting heart rate is 120. And then I build my zones from there based on my estimated percentages.
Okay, that's really simple. That's great.
Yeah. And then as I get more experience with how my body responds to working at some of those percentages, I can evaluate, okay, for me, my tempo zone or my threshold point is not 80%, it's 82%.
Yeah. Okay, I got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brody.
I have more of a comment that, you know, as you were talking, looking at the percentage ranges that kind of typically, you know, riders will reside in, you know, it makes you really step back and think. Like, I go through these big fatigue phases, especially while mountain biking, like in the dawn or something where I'm exerting myself a lot. I find every ride I'm probably going beyond the endurance zone more than I should. And I think, like, after seeing this, I need to step back and look at, you know, how I'm structuring my rides to make sure I don't go into that detraining zone that you talk about. So it was more of a comment than anything else. This is kind of good information. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and that's kind of where the difference between planning your riding towards a specific goal of say increasing your speed over a season is a little bit different sometimes than just going out and having a fun ride every other day. It does take a little bit of discipline sometimes to say, okay, I have to keep this ride a little slower. So that hill that I would normally attack my way up, nope, today is an endurance ride. I have to keep it below 80%.
Yeah, I'll have to work on that for sure.
You and me both.
It makes sense, and I don't do it, and I think that's probably why I'm suffering some of the things that happen to me every season. So it's interesting. Thanks.
Is that a simple explanation of what happens to all of us at the end of the season?
No.
Yes, exactly.
I think it is.
It's called training fatigue.
Yeah, like everybody I've heard before, You know, like basically you come out of the winter as you at your fastest, assuming you went through winter on like a trainer program, and then you basically like kind of decline, have beers, and kill yourself all summer, and then you go back and like hopefully you know, pick up the pieces kind of thing. But I've definitely heard it before, so it's good to hear it again, man.
You get worse all season just for the winter, right?
All right. Any other questions before I jump into the last little bit of this? All right. So we've covered off the endurance portion. Now, what about that last 20-ish% of our training time? Now, for that, we're looking to work near our maximum heart rate to get the physiological adaptations that are only to be found at this end of the spectrum. Here, we're looking to increase our lung capacity, strengthen tendon, increase the ability of our muscles to turn the pedals, and deal with lactate for those days when we do need to work a little harder on our club rides, right? Maybe the nuke gets a little spicy. Now, there are a wide variety of intervals that target the entire range of our energy systems. There are even intervals to target aerobic endurance. The ones we're going to focus on tonight are specifically aimed towards VO2 max and anaerobic threshold. Now, that might look like one of these sessions. Just a few examples of dozens of possible sessions that have been engineered to give us the training stimulus we're looking for. Some of these are very obviously longer than others. Some have relatively short work intervals. They may target the physiology in slightly different ways, but every single one of these sessions ends up being exactly as hard as every other session. The goal during our interval sessions is going to be a consistent effort from the first rep through the last rep. Between reps, we're riding at a nice recovery pace. Very important to note, intense interval training is hard on the body. It puts strain on tendons, large and small muscle groups, and the heart and lungs. A proper warm-up is an absolute necessity before any intense interval training. So now we've got a bit of understanding about the parts. We can look at what a typical training week might look like. Now here in week one, I've got a nice endurance ride on Tuesday with an interval session Thursday. And then a pair of long endurance group rides to end my week. In week two, let's say we substitute in a hills ride on Thursday, and we'll add in a couple of sprint efforts to our Sunday group ride. All of this is getting based around the time that we have available to train. If we have less time, we're going to make adjustments to the schedule. Now remember, rest days are important. We're recovering on those rest days so that we can benefit from super compensation. It doesn't mean, though, that we have to sit around on the sofa. Rest days are great days where we can work on flexibility or skills. Core workouts are really beneficial as well. Cycling is a rare sport that relies really heavily on core strength, but does absolutely nothing to build it. So we really need to add at least one core workout per week to our schedule. My final point for tonight is to remember training discipline. Endurance days need to stay in that endurance zone. And on those recovery days, we need to recover. For the hard days, listen to your body. If you get out there and get a couple of intervals in and just feel horrible, sometimes it's better to cut it short and just enjoy going for a ride. That is the point after all. And with that, a final question period.
Matt, it's Campbell again. Could you suggest a good source for like creating like templates for training plans? Like sort of a baseline, sort of fill in the blanks kind of thing? Because I've actually never had a training plan, so I have no clue as to actually how to create one.
Yeah. So how does that one look? Right. So this one is actually looks like you muted yourself there, Campbell.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing I'm talking about.
Yeah. So if you have a close look at this, it really ends up being pretty much exactly what Dark Horse's weekly evening ride schedule looks like. Right. You've got your Tuesday nuke, your endurance ride with some efforts. You've got a hills ride maybe, or if you're not doing hills, you go and do an interval session instead. And then you've got your couple of weekend long endurance rides.
Okay, so just one more thing on that. So I kind of, when I was riding with the group, so I guess this would be my third year, but I'm kind of trying to work between intermediate A and intermediate B.
Okay.
And I don't know that I'll ever get beyond that, but some of the rides in the week don't, I probably can't keep up with them to begin with.
Okay.
So I'm just wondering what I should do about that.
Yeah, that's fair. So if you have training time during the week, you can structure it in whatever way kind of fits your schedule, right? That's the important first determination, is what does my schedule look like? How can I, how much time do I have to train, and where can I train? Now on my sample training weeks here that's on the screen, you'll see I've kind of got a rest day every other day. Let's say that your schedule doesn't allow for that, right? And you've got Tuesday, Wednesday that you can train, and you've got Saturday, Sunday that you can train. I would say you can always do endurance rides back to back. Don't do interval sessions back to back ever. Right? Now there are occasions if you're training for specific events where a coach might set those kind of training days for you. But generally, as an amateur athlete just trying to get faster on a club ride, you don't want that much high intensity training on back-to-back days. Okay. So if I was doing Tuesday, Wednesday, I would decide which day I'm going to do my endurance and which day I'm going to do my intense intervals. And I would probably do my intervals on the day that I'm fresher, because they're going to be exhausting. And then my endurance ride, when I'm tired already, is actually a decent way to build extra endurance input into that endurance ride. Okay? But again, it's really going to depend on what your availability is. The most important thing to remember is that approximate 80-20 split.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I have another question, Matt.
For sure.
And this is specific to running. I both run and cycle, and as far as I can tell, I don't think there's any real muscle groups that are common except for maybe your heart and lungs. But is running, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but is running on the rest day okay? Or is that not okay?
I don't have a specific knowledge around triathlon training, for example, which would cover that need to train those two similar-ish, but ultimately different disciplines. I would say again that it depends on where you are. Like most running is going to be endurance training, and so you could quantify that run as an endurance training day. Now, running also is a little harder on joints and tendons. So I wouldn't schedule a run on the day immediately after, say, an interval session. I might schedule it after an endurance session, and then have a rest day between any interval session and any run. But otherwise, I don't see why not. At that point, it's just additional endurance training.
Okay, thanks.
Annie?
So does the simple training weeks that you've put there, can you apply that no matter what level you are? Like I consider myself to be a beginner. There's some intermediate people, there's some very good people that this would apply. It's just that, for example, my hard effort is going to be like half of yours or something, but it's the same plan. Is that?
Yes. So you will see that specifically on the interval sessions, if I can find where that is. So on the interval sessions here, and these are direct from Cycling Canada's reference material and course material. None of these have an output requirement, and none of these actually reference a heart rate zone. The goal is to go as hard as you can and complete the session. Okay. And generally by doing so, you might not get there the first time, but you'll self-adjust and you'll end up training in the right zone and at the right intensity. And then over time, as you build additional fitness, you'll see those improvements.
Okay.
Right. So yes, the idea does ultimately apply to whether you classify yourself as a beginner or casual cyclist, or even if you're Team Sunweb.
Okay, that's good, because those zones, I can barely talk, or it's difficult, or it's easy. It's still hard to map for a beginner. So
yes, absolutely. And that's where having some idea of both ways of measuring kind of come in handy. If it's becoming somewhat strenuous and I'm starting to have difficulty talking, that can sometimes be a pretty useful indicator. I think it was it this one? Yeah. So by hard to talk, it means you can't carry on a conversation. You can't speak in sentences. It's 3 to 4 words at a time, but otherwise breathing reasonably heavily. Easy to talk means, it doesn't mean that we're sitting down having tea, but it means that I can answer directly in sentences, right? And cannot talk is no, gotta go harder. Okay.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm going to put this guy up while we're, just in case anyone wants to note down a couple of these for their own use. Belle.
Yeah. Is this cycling specific or can we use it for other sports?
It can absolutely be used for other sports. Dr. Seiler first noticed this training distribution, I think in, what is her name? Bjorgen, who is like the winningest women's Olympic athlete ever. And she's a cross-country skier. She's like 8 or 10 golds, several silvers, and several bronzes. And she also, that's how she trains, 80-20. And that was kind of where he first latched onto and understood that this was meaningful, and this was how world-class athletes were training, right? Because for years we had this idea that in order to get faster, you have to push harder. That's where what is it? I don't recall. Pyramidal is a little more in the middle. There's a training philosophy that is basically you do a lot of hard riding and you do a little bit of easy riding, and that's how you get faster. But that's also how you get hurt, or how you get
You don't want to ride anymore.
yeah, you hate your life. You can hurt yourself. You can actually get slower over a season if you do too much. I see a couple of knowing nods there. If you do too much intensity, right? Because the body can't handle that kind of intensity. The human body is a well-adapted, well-evolved endurance machine. Right? A human being who's got a little bit of training can run down a horse, because you just run for hours and the horse can't.
I think this is true. I just don't think of ever catching horses.
Okay. Any other questions about any of what I went over tonight, even tangentially related?
Yeah, Campbell, I got a tangential one. Is that I've found it very difficult to find a heart rate monitor that's consistent in its readings. So I find I've had a heart condition, so that may be, and I've like had open heart surgery, so there's steel in my chest, so that may affect it. But where just all of a sudden the heart rate monitor just drops out, there's no reading.
Okay.
Is that a common thing that people experience, or is that something that's unique to me? Because I've tried different types of heart rate monitors. I've got a Garmin now, and it'll work great for one ride, and then the next time I'll go out and I look down and there's no heart rate showing up there.
Okay. So sometimes that's a question of signal interference, and sometimes I would say that it can be a sign that your heart rate monitor isn't necessarily in the right spot or snug enough. Now, if you've got consistency in it being snug but not tight, and you're still seeing that dropping out, then maybe a chest strap isn't the right fit for you. There are heart rate straps, I think, that strap around the upper arm, just above the bicep. There are heart rate monitor watches that can communicate with cycling head units. They use a slightly different technology to measure heart rate than the electrical signal ones in a heart rate strap, but there are different options. But I'm not sure within your specific case, whether it's related to the extra metal in your chest, or whether it's something about the heart rate monitor itself.
Yeah, my cardiologist says that it shouldn't be affecting it. So, but I've tried 3 different kinds, and I got the Garmin. I've now got a Garmin watch, but or at least a wristband, but it doesn't actually. It doesn't work with cycling. So it's not. It's good when I'm running, but it's not good for cycling. So.
Sometimes the placement is important, right? So when I strap on my heart rate monitor, it's just below and across the bottom of my pectoral muscles. If you've got it too high, the muscles can interfere. So
right.
I don't know.
I strap it just below I usually strap it just below my what would be my breast. I don't know what else. Sorry, I don't know the terminology, but
pecs.
Yeah, okay, right below your pecs there. That's where I would put it.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Anyways, that was tangential.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. If you don't have a good way to measure, some of this becomes a little more tricky.
I can say this, Matt and Campbell, like I just switched over to a Wahoo ticker for the exact same reason, thinking my Garmin was causing me problems, and the ticker is still having the same problem. So I'm pretty sure it's a fitment issue and it's myself. And, some of these, I think it's a pretty common issue, I think, at this point with heart rate monitors. So.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry but so if it is a common thing and not unique to me, how do you, couldn't that potentially throw the accuracy off of what you're trying to train for significantly?
Yes, which is where having an idea of something like the Borg scale, where you have a relative perceived exertion. So you can tell when you're working really hard and about to pass out. It's fairly obvious at that point that you're not in your endurance zone.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, fair enough.
I don't know. Does anyone else have some experience that might help Campbell out?
Yeah, I think Michael hit it on the head when he said heart rate monitors, because I've had this experience as well. They either don't read at all, or they give like a ridiculously low number, or they seem to be quite accurate. They correspond to what I would consider my Borg number. So I don't think that with heart rate monitors, it's an accuracy issue. It's either working or it's not. That's my experience anyway.
Yeah, Campbell, that's what I found is, again, I'll be riding and it's working, and I'm riding and it's working, it's great. The next thing I know, I look down, there's no reading. And then later on in the ride, the reading's back again. So I don't know. I can't tell.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
How hard are you working on some of these rides? How long into it? And the other comment I made, and I think somebody echoed in on, was about about wetting the strap. So I'll jump on the trainer with a dry strap, knowing that it won't work until I start sweating. If I want it immediately, I will wet it. Or if I want to ensure, like if I'm going to go on Zwift and I'm going to do a race. So if I go on a trainer road workout, I'm warming up and then I'm going at an interval. So I know when I hit that interval, I'm sweating, and that connection, the conductivity between my chest and the strap will be made. But if I'm going to do a Zwift race where I'm riding at endurance / threshold, or if I'm going to go on a club ride, I'll actually wet the strap in order to create that initial conductivity. So what I guess what I'm getting at is, if you find it's dropping out, are you perhaps riding easy? You're not sweating anymore. Is that possibly something?
Oh, it sure is. I don't ride like you guys do, for sure.
Okay.
So, but I do wet it every time I put it before I put it on. So, but yeah, so I have a high intensity that wouldn't. And again, I haven't been training like you guys are talking about, but I don't ride at a high intensity for me where I'm sweating bullets. And then I back it off and I take it easy because I know I can't keep it going. And then once I feel good, I'll take another shot at it, kind of thing. That's
So
kind of what
I'd
I
be
do.
curious to test when it drops out. Take your water bottle, shoot yourself in the chest, or just put some on your hand and rub it up underneath there, you know, and see if it kicks back in. I would try that.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll give that a shot.
There was, I remember it was years ago, probably 20 years ago, heart rate monitor straps were just becoming a thing, and you can buy this lubricant that you would use instead of simply wetting it. You know, I don't know whether it actually was real or not, or whether it really did anything, or whether it was just another lubricant that you would use for any other purpose, I suppose. But there used to be a thing.
Is
Thank
the
you.
strap tight
Thank
enough?
you. Well, I think so. You know, I've followed the instructions, which are pretty straightforward,
Yeah,
but
it's not sliding down or anything.
No, it's not sliding, it's snug. And as I said, sorry, I don't mean to monopolize your conversation here, but it seemed, I'll wear it and one time for the entire ride, it's perfect. And then the next time it's intermittent. It just seems to be, and I've tried, as I said, I've tried 3 different monitors, or 3 different heart rate straps. Well, I had a Polar, and then I had a Cat Eye, and then I've now got a Garmin. And I experienced the same problem with it. So I was just thinking it must be me in some way, must be something but it sounds like other people do have these problems, so it isn't just me. But
yeah,
anyway.
The only thing I can recommend is try experimenting a little bit with the placement as well, because you do have that that extra metal in your chest. It may be interfering with the normal sensing mechanism. So try a little higher, try a little lower. I've even heard of people wearing the heart rate monitor backwards, where the sensing pads are on the back. You could give that a try too.
Oh, I've never heard it. Yeah, that's a great idea. I will try those different things you guys have been suggesting. I appreciate you taking the time to make those suggestions. Thank you.
Right. Any final questions?
Awesome. Matt, I think if there's no more questions, I'll say thank you so much from everyone. This was awesome, and I think we all have some stuff to go back and think about on our weekly rides. I know I do. I know I'm when I'm on a club ride next time, and someone starts going, maybe I won't go with them. Maybe I'll just let them go, right? Because I think I become subjective to that, and then the next thing you know, you're like, why am I always exhausted or tired? And you're like, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that ride. So I have to sit there and think about that. Henderson, you're one of them. When you start climbing hills on Brimley, I know I'm like, oh, you shouldn't do that, but there goes Henderson.
Yeah, you did an excellent job, Matt, of putting in very useful information in 1 hour in what is a huge topic. It's been really, really great.
Yeah.
But I'm glad I came.
Here. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Matt. Wonderful job.
I look forward to seeing you all out on the bike at some point this year. That'd be awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That was really good.
Yeah.
If you guys do think of questions later that didn't come to you, or if you want any of the data tables, you can shoot me an email and I will answer your questions or send you the information.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Awesome. And this will be up on YouTube at some point, so we'll let you guys know when I get it edited and up there, so you can go watch again if you really want it. Anyways, thanks everyone. Matt, if there's nothing else, I can kind of say bye and let everyone start to sign off if that makes sense.